Before viewing video lessons, it is important to read the textbook using the learning guide as your turn-by-turn directions. Then use the learning guide to take organized notes in your own words with examples and pictures. Chapter 2, Psychological Research. This video will focus on experimental research design. This is the scientific process we've been discussing. We're working on the ethical research method and design step. There are three different types of designs: descriptive, correlational, and experimental. The difference between descriptive and correlational designs and experimental designs has to do with control. In experimental research, the researcher exercises control over at least one of the variables. They manipulate this variable so that subjects get differing amounts or differing types of this particular variable. It's through this manipulation and control that we can begin to determine cause and effect relationships between variables. Descriptive and correlational designs are used when we're either unable or unwilling to control or manipulate variables, and there are no conclusions that can be drawn regarding cause and effect because we don't exercise any control. In an experiment, we're trying to figure out how one variable, in this case x, affects another variable, in this case y. So what we want to do is control the conditions so that the only thing that's different between subjects is the variable that we're manipulating, in this case x. And if we see any change in y, we'll be able to begin to detect a cause and effect relationship. The variable that is manipulated or controlled is called the independent variable. This variable will be at different levels for different participants, so that it's not exactly the same for everyone. The dependent variable is the variable that we hypothesize will be affected by manipulation of the independent variable. The dependent variable is measured the same for all subjects. So we want to use the same ruler, the same measuring stick, to figure out if the independent variable caused movement. There's another set of variables that can sometimes affect the dependent variable. These are variables that the researcher is not necessarily directly manipulating or controlling. And if these variables have an effect on the dependent variable, it can make my conclusions less firm. In experimental research, what we will do is we will select a sample from the greater population of interest. So if I was interested in college students, for example, I wouldn't be able to do research on every single college student, but I could do research on a smaller sample. So once I have this smaller sample, in experimental research, I would do a procedure called random assignments to assign them to the different independent variable conditions. These groups are called the experimental or the control group. It is only through the use of random assignments that we can start to say that if there is a difference between groups, that those differences are due to my independent variable. Random assignment is one way we deal with extraneous and confounding variables. We sort of randomly distribute those so that they don't have too great of impact on either the experimental or the control group. If we had a research study that was looking at how we can control pain, let's use headaches for example. What we might do is draw a sample of headache sufferers, migraine headache sufferers from the overall population. Then we can divide that sample into two groups using random assignment. One group, the experimental group, will get my independent variable, in this case morphine, when they have a headache. The other group, the control group, they will get a placebo, or basically a syringe with inactive materials inside. It could just be saline solution or maybe a little sugar water or something. And then at the end of this procedure, we would measure the same thing using the same measurement in both groups. That's my dependent variable. In this case, my dependent variable would be pain. So I would ask each participant at the end how much pain they had. Now that procedure is a very simple design in which there are just one independent variable and one dependent variable. There are also some ways that this can vary. One way this can vary is to use a single group as both the experimental and control group. In this case, when the participants got a migraine headache, the first headache, half of them would get morphine and half would get the placebo. The second headache, they would switch. And so basically we would be comparing a person to themselves, and that can help reduce extraneous variables. Another way experimental designs can vary is through the manipulation of more than one independent variable. So for example, I might be interested in morphine in conjunction with some other medication, and then of course the placebo. And that would give me 3 different independent variable conditions. This could allow me to study the interaction between morphine and other medications, for example, but it would also require me to have a much larger sample. Another way experimental designs can vary is through the use of more than one dependent variable. So I may be interested in how morphine impacts not just pain, but I may also be measuring muscle tension, sleep habits, eating habits, all kinds of things, so I can get a complete picture of what morphine, the independent variable, affects. When we have data from an experimental design, we will use statistics called inferential statistics. These are the type of statistics that we will use to determine if there is a significant difference between the experimental and control group. Inferential statistics assume that the population is normal. This is like the normal curve distribution, and that the sample is a good sample of that normal population. Of course, this may not always be an accurate assumption. When we're testing to see if there is a difference between groups in experimental designs, we test something called the null hypothesis. The null hypothesis basically says that if you have a normal sample from a normal population, and you randomly assign that sample to 2 groups, the experimental and the control group, you'll have 2 groups that start out just like the normal sample, the normal population. They're equal groups. So at the end of the research, they should still be equal. That's the null hypothesis. There's no relationship between those variables. The research hypothesis is usually the hypothesis that suggests a relationship. In the case of our example, The hypothesis may be that morphine will cause a reduction in headaches. That would be my research hypothesis. But statistically, I would test the null hypothesis. And we say that there is a statistically significant difference between the two groups, experimental and control, when the chance that that difference is due to just pure luck, just some weird groups that got created, is 5 chances in 100 or less. So this basically means that we have a really high standard for saying that something is statistically significant. This is important because inferential statistics are built on several assumptions. The assumption of the normal population, the assumption of a sample that accurately reflects that normal population, the assumption that random assignment has created 2 identical groups. So in conclusion, there are several strengths to experimental research. The biggest strength is that this is the only research design where we can begin to draw conclusions about cause and effect relationships. The weaknesses of experimental research is that sometimes, because we have so much control over so many variables, they can sometimes be artificial. You can have an effect that you only see in the laboratory but not in real life. The other weaknesses are that experiments are sometimes unable to be done because they are unethical. It would be unethical to abuse children to prove that it's not good for you. And sometimes they're not practical. So at this point, we have concluded our ethical research method and design by talking about ethics, descriptive research, correlational research, and finally, experimental research.